Wyoming, high in the rugged mountains of the West. A late summer morning in 1878, Jacob Kane, a former soldier of the Civil War, lived in an exiled solitude, shunning the world he had once pledged to serve. His wife and child had perished in a crossfire of hatred long ago, a collateral damage in a war that had no official name. He carried their memory not as an open wound, but as a quiet, ever-present ghost that shaped every silent breath he took. He had sought refuge in this abandoned military signal station, now a makeshift cabin hidden among the stoic pines and unforgiving granite, to escape both the company of men and the gnawing grip of his own regret. On a cold, clear dawn, Jacob awoke to a strange, jarring silhouette against the cabin's familiar roofline, rigid and out of place in the pale morning light. He stepped outside, the frosted pine needles crunching under his stiffened leather boots, and then he saw her. A young blonde woman was hanging motionless from the roof's ridge beam, her bare feet dangling just above the ground, her long, tangled hair brushing against the crudely burned letters that had been scorched into the heavy wooden door beneath her. Native lover. His stomach clenched into a hard, cold knot. He approached, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs, the sky still a half-dark, bruised purple behind him. The sharp, acrid smell of charred wood stung his nose. Raw and accusing, he reached into the waistband of his trousers for the heavy Colt revolver he always carried, only to realize that, instinctively, he had no will to use it. To kill was no longer the thing he feared least. Not here. Not now. When he leaned closer, he saw her chest rise and fall, a slow, uneven, and fragile movement. She was not dead, but she was dying. Her skin was as pale as the new snow on the Ow. High peaks, her cheeks stained with dirt, and the dried, rust-colored tracks of old blood. Her eyes were closed tight, her lashes a dark fringe against her colorless skin. Her breathing was shallow, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, but it was unmistakably the breath of the living. Jacob blinked, a wave of sheer, unadulterated disbelief rippling through him. He braced himself under her arms, his own muscles, protesting the sudden, unaccustomed weight, and lifted. He felt her weight lean into his strength, as fragile and as light as a broken bird. He slung her over his shoulder with a careful, deliberate purpose, ignoring the sharp ache in muscles that were unused to tenderness. As he began the careful descent down the steep, rocky slope behind the cabin, the world around him seemed to shift. The forest held its breath, a silent witness to the intrusion. But then the silence was shattered. The sharp, unmistakable crack of gunfire echoed through the trees. Not a single shot, but a series of bursts distant, urgent, and undeniably threatening. Someone knew she was not dead. Someone had seen her, had perhaps been watching, hunting her. Jacob tightened his grip on the unconscious woman, her faint, fluttering pulse a desperate drum beat against his back. He did not falter. He ran his heavy boots skidding on the loose stone, the branches of the pines clawing at his coat like desperate hands, toward the small, hidden lean-to he had built near a hidden stream. Safety, such as it was a few slow, agonizing minutes away, but in that time each step felt like a race, with salvation or bloodlust in hot pursuit. When he finally reached the edge of the small, sheltered clearing, with the ragged pines at his back and his rough shelter ahead, he dared to hope that no one else had followed, that the sound had been a trick of the wind, an echo from a distant hunt. He eased her down gently, laying her on a thick bed of furs and blankets he kept for emergencies, for the brutal, unforgiving winters. Her hair, tangled and golden, spilled across the dark furs like sunlight trapped in a web of cloth. He knelt beside her and gently lifted her chin. Her pale, cracked lips parted. Her eyelashes fluttered against her bruised cheeks. She took a single, shaky, gasping breath. He exhaled, a long, ragged sound, without noticing he had been holding his own breath out in the still, cold air of the clearing. The only sound was her ragged inhalation and the distant, fading echo of fear from beyond the trees. He knelt there in the dim morning light, listening to her breathing as if it were a secret only he was allowed to hear. He could not yet think about what came next, or who had done this to her, or why. He could only know, with a profound and terrifying certainty, that she was alive, and that he would not let her die here. Not by wood, or by flame, or by the cruel, calculated vengeance of men. Outside, the forest seemed to pulse with a renewed life, the pines whispering secrets above, the distant gunshots now gone silent, at least for now. And Jacob listened, his heart pounding a new, unfamiliar rhythm as he waited for her eyes to open. She burned with a deep, consuming fever through the first day and the next. Jacob did what he could, his movements practiced and efficient from his years in the army. He cleaned the raw, ugly wounds on her wrists and ankles, the places where the rope or wire had bitten deep into her skin. He bathed her head in cool water, drawn from the spring that ran behind his cabin, a hidden ribbon of life in the harsh, rocky landscape. He wrapped her limbs in clean linen. He stripped from his own old shirts. She stirred only once during those first 2 days, her body thrashing in a delirious, fevered dream. She whispered one name, over and over, like a broken string on a fiddle, repeating the same sad note in the wind. Tahono. Tahono. The name was foreign to him. Apache or Arapaho, he guessed. It haunted the silence of his small cabin, a ghost of a life he could not begin to comprehend. That night, while the fire in the stone hearth crackled low, she woke in a sudden, violent panic. Her arms flailed, her breath turning sharp and ragged. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and reached toward her own neck, her fingers clawing for something invisible, something that was choking her. "Get away!" she cried, her voice a strangled rasp. "Let me go. I'll die before you take me back." Jacob moved fast, grabbing her wrists, his grip not harsh, but firm and unyielding. She struggled against him with a surprising, desperate strength, her teeth clenched, her legs kicking wildly against the rough-spun blankets. "You're safe," he said, his voice calm and steady, the voice he had once used to soothe spooked. "Horses and frightened recruits. You're not there anymore. You're safe here." She didn't believe him. Her eyes, wide and wild with terror, darted around the small, fire-lit room. Then, with a sudden, powerful lunge, she lunged toward the fireplace, her hand reaching for the heavy iron blade he used to split kindling. He caught her around the waist, pulling her back hard against his chest, her small, trembling body a stark contrast to the solid wall of his own. "Don't," he said, his voice a low, urgent murmur against her hair. "Not like this. Not when you've made it this far." Her body trembled, her breath hitching in a series of painful, racking sobs. For a long moment, she sagged in his arms, like someone who had been running too far for too long, and had just realized there was still more road to go. He slowly, carefully, loosened his hold. She turned, her movements slow and wary, her voice cracked and filled with a profound distrust. Who are you?" "My name's Jacob," he said, his own voice quiet. "Jacob Kane. This is my place, or what's left of it. You found me?" He nodded. Her eyes lowered, her gaze falling to the floor. She sat on the rough-hewn floorboards, her legs folded beneath her, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, as if she were a child trying to hold herself together. Then, after a long, heavy silence, she whispered, "My name is Alara. Alara." Crane. Jacob froze. Crane. The name hit him like a musket shot to the chest. He had not heard it in years, but once it had been inked in bold, arrogant script across the orders that had sent mercenaries, not soldiers, into the peaceful Arapaho lands. Orders signed by Nathaniel Crane, a plantation baron from the South, a cattle lord, and a self-proclaimed purifier of the borders. Elara continued, unaware of the sudden, dangerous shift in Jacob's gaze. "He's my father," she said flatly, "or he was." Jacob said nothing. "I ran away years ago after he hit me for the last time." Her voice grew tight, the words forced out. "I didn't just run. I followed someone. Tohono. He saved me when I was bleeding in the creek behind our land. He said I wasn't the enemy. He said no one is born an enemy." "You loved him," Jacob said softly, the words a statement, not a question. She nodded, the movement small and sharp. "We lived in the canyons, far from everything. I learned his language. I wore his mother's beads. I slept under the stars." A single tear, hot and silent, ran down her cheek. "They came for us last winter. White men. Some of them I recognized. From the ranch. Some my father had paid." She shook her head, as if denying the memory could somehow kill it. "Tohono died protecting me. I saw him fall. I didn't scream. I couldn't." "They took you," Jacob said, his voice a low growl. She raised the sleeve of her dress. The bruises had faded, but the burn marks hadn't. They were the shape of a branding iron, a cruel, intricate C for her family name. "They called me a witch, a whore, an Arapaho lover. They said I had shamed my blood. They tied me up, dragged me from town to town, and then they left me hanging." Her voice finally broke. "To make sure no other girl ever tried to love someone like him again." Jacob looked at her, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The fire hissed. His hands had balled into tight, white-knuckled fists before he even knew it. Her story stirred something old and bitter inside him. Memories of other campfires, lit too close to the smell of smoke and blood, of children screaming in languages no one bothered to understand. Elara fell silent, her eyes drooping with a profound exhaustion, a humiliation that went deeper than any physical wound. "You can hate me," she whispered. "Everyone else does." Jacob sat beside her on the floor, staring into the flames. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged breath. "I don't hate you." She turned toward him slowly, her eyes wide and searching. "You think I betrayed my kind?" "No," he said, his voice firm. "I think the ones who say that have never known what real love looks like." She blinked, her lip trembling. "I should have died with him." Jacob reached for the fire poker, stirring the embers, and whispered without looking at her, "You didn't. And that ain't betrayal. That's survival. Only cowards fear a soul brave enough to love across a line drawn in the dirt by other men." Elara lowered her face to her hands, and for the first time since her world had burned, she cried without shame, the sound a quiet, aching release in the small, fire-lit cabin. The fire burned low that night, casting long, trembling shadows against the rough-hewn wooden walls. Jacob sat outside the cabin, on the cold stone steps beneath the moonlight, a tin cup of black, bitter coffee untouched in his hands. His eyes stared out into the dark, silent woods, but he was not seeing the trees or the stars. He was seeing fire. 15 years ago, the flames had danced higher than the roofs of the small Arapaho village. The screams had been louder than the crack of the rifles. Jacob had stood at the edge of the burning settlement, a young soldier in a blue uniform, his own rifle held useless in his hands. His unit had been ordered not to engage, to simply observe and report. It had not mattered. Not to the men with the torches, not to the ones who called themselves the purifiers, their faces flushed with hatred and the thrill of spilled blood. The village had been an ally of the fort, a peaceful community of women and children and old men, mostly. But they were too close to the sprawling Crane Ranch, and the whispers of their young men, mingling with the daughters of homesteaders, had been enough to bring the fires. He had gone back once the dust had settled, once the purifiers had ridden off, laughing and drunk on their victory. He had been looking for survivors. Instead, he had found his wife, Sarah, crumpled by the riverbank, struck by a stray shot from the chaos. His 3-year-old daughter, Lily, was limp beside her, caught in the same senseless, indiscriminate frenzy. They had been visiting, bringing food and medicine to a midwife friend in the village. Wrong place, wrong day, wrong company. No one had ever answered for their deaths. The official report had called it a tragic casualty of an unfortunate Indian raid. The man who had led that purge, who had signed the map and named the targets, had been a man named Clayton Redding, the same fanatic who had once publicly declared that all hybrids and sympathizers must be cleansed from the land. The same man whose hatred needed no justification, just a match and a convenient reason. Jacob had buried his family with his own hands, their small bodies wrapped in his own uniform jacket. Then he had disappeared into the mountains, deserting his post, his honor, and his belief in any kind of justice. He had vowed never to draw a weapon again, never to stand with one side over another, never again to be a part of any man's war. Until now, inside the cabin, Alara slept fitfully. She had curled up in the far corner of the room, wrapped in wool and a fragile silence. Her fever had finally broken, but not her nightmares. That morning, she had found his old army rifle, hidden under the loose floorboards of the cabin. She had brought it to him, her eyes confused and cold. "This is yours," he had nodded. "The trigger's gone." He had removed it the day he buried his daughter, had left the small piece of metal buried in the earth beside her, a vow no bullet could ever rewrite. "I don't shoot anymore," he had said. She had stared at him, her gaze intense. "Not even if they come back for me?" He had said nothing. She didn't argue. She just handed him the useless, heavy rifle and had walked away, her shoulders heavy with all the battles she was not yet ready to fight. That afternoon, Jacob had begun rebuilding the old, half-ruined hunter's hut that was deeper in the woods, a place he had abandoned long ago. He had fixed the roof, cleared the thick overgrowth, and had replaced the shattered door with a new one, hewn from a fallen pine. He had laid down new, clean blankets, and had rebuilt the small fire pit with his own bare hands. He had done it not because she had asked, but because it gave her a space that was her own, because it gave her a small measure of dignity. When she had found it the next morning, she had stood silently in the doorway, staring at the small, rough vegetable patch he had begun to clear nearby. Rows of potato sprouts he had transplanted from his own garden, sprigs of wild thyme, and a cluster of wild onions. Healing would not come fast, he knew, but it would come. Alara had turned to him then, her eyes wide and wet. "You built this?" "For me?" He had nodded once. "I never asked you to." "You didn't need to." For a long moment, she had said nothing. Then she had stepped into the small hut, sat on the edge of the new bedding, and had stared at the rich, dark soil outside as if it held the bones of her past. He had watched her shoulders tremble, and then, soundless and slow, she had begun to cry. Not the wild, racking sobs of her grief, but the aching, quiet release of someone who had not allowed herself to weep since death had first knocked on her door. That Jacob had not spoken. He had not moved closer. He had let her be. This wasn't about being saved. It was about surviving together, but alone when they needed to be. The forest had whispered around them, and for the first time in 15 years, the man who thought he had nothing left to give had given something more lasting than bullets. He had given her shelter. He had given her peace, and in return, she had given him the first fragile tears of her trust. The wind carried more than the scent of pine needles that morning. It carried voices, low, distant, and angry. Rumors spread fast through the small, isolated towns of the territory, like dust on a dry wind. But lies traveled faster, and by noon, that day, they reached the ears of men who had always been looking for an excuse to cleanse the land with blood. An Arapaho lover still breathing. Clayton Redding sat in a smoky saloon 2 towns south of the mountains, his heavy boots propped. On a table, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, when the whisper reached him. A rider from the foothills had seen something. A flash of blonde hair near the old, abandoned signal station. A strange man, moving through the woods. Redding stood slowly, his hand twitching near the old revolver that hung at his belt. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The rider, a young man with more greed than sense, nodded eagerly. "A mountain man's hiding her. One of your old boys said he saw the tracks. A woman's prints, small and recent." Redding's grin was full of an old, familiar hate. "She's a ghost," he said. "We should have burned her the first. Time, let's finish it right." By nightfall, he had 6 riders saddled and ready. They wore no badges, just the cold, hard look of men who hated silence and mixed bloodlines. Meanwhile, up in the high, lonely hills, another knock sounded at Jacob's door. He opened it, his hand already behind the frame, near his axe. A local trapper, a man he knew by sight but not by name, stood nervously on the step, his hat clutched in his hands. "I don't want no trouble, Kane," the man said, his eyes darting around the clearing. "But you ought to know. There's a bounty out. A quiet one, posted in coins and cattle. An Arapaho lover's head brings it in, real clean." Jacob said nothing. The trapper looked down at his own feet, ashamed. "I seen you once with her, near the creek. Just figured you ought to know what's coming." He left as quickly as he came, a ghost with a conscience. Inside the cabin, Alara had heard every word. She was packing her small bag before Jacob could even speak. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "I have to go. They'll kill you if they find me here. They'll kill you if you go." She looked at him, her eyes hard with a desperate resolve. "You saved me once. I'm not asking you to do it a second time." Jacob took a deep breath. He stepped forward. "I lost a wife and a child because I followed orders," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper. "I stood still when I should have spoken up. I watched the fire take everything I loved, and I called it fate. I will not do that again." She opened her mouth to argue, but he wasn't done. "You are not baggage. You are not a burden. You are a human being, and I am done pretending that the world gets to decide which ones are worth protecting." Her shoulders dropped, but her gaze did not. "They will come?" "I know," he said. That night, Jacob went into the woods alone. He moved like a shadow, quiet, calculated, and unseen. He had not touched a weapon in years, but that didn't mean he had forgotten how to survive. He laid traps, not the kind to kill, but the kind to slow, to maim. He set alarm wires made of old tins and broken glass that would rattle and clang. He rigged trip branches along the narrow ridge trail, a silent perimeter of warnings, not of violence. When he returned to the cabin, the sky was beginning to bruise with the first light of dawn. Alara was waiting by the fire, her fingers wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. "You could have run," she said quietly. "I could have," he replied. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Because I have seen. Men fight to possess, to own, to chain. That's not why I'm here. Then why?" He set a hand gently on the table between them, not touching her, but close enough. "I just want you to live." She didn't speak. Her throat had tightened too fast for words. No one had ever said that to her before, not even Tohono. People had wanted her to be silent, to be loyal, to be useful, to be beautiful. No one had simply wanted her to be breathing. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, Alara Crane didn't feel like someone who was running. She felt seen. Behind them, the woods remained still. But beyond the ridges, the hoofbeats had started, quiet at first, but growing a steady, relentless rhythm of hate, coming closer. The war wasn't done. But neither were they. The wind shifted after sundown. Jacob felt it first, not in the rustling of the pines, but as a tight, cold pull in his gut, the quiet before something sharp and final. He rose from the cot where he had been resting and checked the perimeter traps. 3 of them were tripped. There had been no sound, no warning, but someone had passed through, their movements careful, deliberate and professional. He returned to the cabin and opened the door without a word. Alara looked up from the fire, her eyes wide with a silent question. "They're here," she asked. Jacob nodded once. "Stay inside," he said, pulling on his old, heavy coat. "No lights, no sound." She stood. "I can help. I need you alive more than I need your help." And then he was gone, melting into the woods like a shadow, sliding between the dark, silent branches. 3 men moved through the forest with hunting knives and rope. One had a long, thin scar that ran down his cheek. Another walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp. The third, the leader, carried a small bottle of kerosene in one hand and a coiled noose in the other. Jacob took the high ground, crouching among the roots of a great pine, watching them. The men whispered as they crept toward the small, rebuilt shelter, their voices carrying on the still night air. They were laughing, a low, cruel sound. "Bet she's pretty when she begs. Better if she's half dead. Easier to string her." Up, Jacob moved fast, dropping behind the last of the 3 men, the one with the limp. He struck hard, a swift, brutal elbow to the throat, a blade to the wrist, just enough to disarm and knock him unconscious. The second man turned, catching a powerful punch full in the jaw before he could even raise his weapon. But the third, the one with the scar, spotted the movement and shouted, drawing a heavy revolver. Gunfire cracked through the trees, the sound. A violent intrusion in the sacred quiet of the mountains. Back at the cabin, Alara heard it. She froze. Then she grabbed the oil lantern, the flint, and a single desperate idea. Outside, Jacob fought like a man who hated violence, but understood its brutal necessities all too well. He dodged, he rolled, he kicked, but they were faster. Now, more alert. 2 against 1, their blades flashing in the faint moonlight. Then came the light. Not from the moon, but from the trees. Flames roared up the dry underbrush in a sudden, terrifying bloom of gold. The fire Alara had started leaped from bush to branch, devouring everything in its path with a hungry, crackling roar. A thick, choking smoke poured over the forest like the breath from hell itself. The attackers turned, shouting, their eyes blinded by the smoke and the sudden, intense heat. Jacob used the moment. He struck fast, breaking the leg of one man, dragging the other into the dirt before he fled. He ran toward the glow, toward the danger, because that was where she was. Alara stood near the base of a high ridge, her dress singed, her hair damp with sweat, holding a single burning stick like a sword. She coughed once, her eyes searching. The smoke-filled woods. When Jacob reached her, he didn't speak. He just grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the narrow ravine trail. They ran together, half choking, half burning, until they reached the mouth of an old, forgotten cave, nestled deep in the canyon wall, a place Jacob had once used during his winter patrols. Inside, the air was cool and safe, but barely. Jacob collapsed first, pulling her down beside him. They lay there in the dark, their breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps, their skin marked with soot and ash. She winced as he gently brushed the hair from her face. A long lock had burned at the ends, singed into a brittle, black curl. "You set the woods on fire," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief, almost a smile in its tone. "Just a little," she rasped. "You could have died." She met his gaze, her eyes shining in the faint, distant glow of the fire. "I know." He paused, his fingers still tangled in the scorched remains of her hair. "Would you have died for me?" Elara swallowed, the question cracking something open inside her that had been frozen for a very long time. "No," she whispered. "I want to live for you." The cave fell silent, except for the sound of their breathing and the distant, fading pop of burning pine. But inside them, something deeper, something more powerful, had caught fire. And this was one fire they would not run from. The town of Stillwater was the kind of place where shadows moved faster than gossip. A dusty collection of adobe buildings and false-fronted stores that baked under the relentless Wyoming sun. Jacob hadn't walked its streets in years, not since the war, not since the smoke and the screams. But now he stood in the back of a crowded trading post, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, and he listened. "Clayton Redding's coming in by the week's end," one man said over a barrel of sugar and dried beans. "He's got business. With the mayor, or maybe something more personal." Personal, like bounty hunting, another man muttered. Jacob stiffened. He turned and walked out, the small bell over the door tinkling behind him. Down the hill, at the edge of town, Elara waited in a wagon they'd borrowed from a sympathetic farmer. Her hood was drawn low, but her eyes scanned every rider, every glint of silver on a belt. When Jacob approached, she spoke without looking at him. "Did you hear his name?" "Yes, then it's him." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a scorched piece of tanned leather, half burned and blackened at the corners. It had been nailed to the door of the old signal station, the place where Jacob had first found her, strung up and left for dead. It bore one word, scorched into the hide with a hot brand, Arapaho lover. Jacob had always thought the burn marks were just random symbols of hate, not actual handwriting. But now, under the harsh sunlight, Elara ran her fingers along the edges. "The angle of the A," she said, her voice a low murmur. "The way the P dips below the line. This was branded by hand, not with a stamp. And you recognize it?" Elara nodded. "Redding used to write letters to my father. Threats, warnings, offers. They had a shared hatred of the Arapaho. The only difference was, my father used gold to get what he wanted. Redding used fire." Her voice cracked. "He threatened to hang Tohono from the town gates. He called him a mud-skinned thief. He wrote it all in a twisted, angry cursive. Just like this." She held up the piece of leather again, her hands not shaking anymore. Jacob took it from her and stared at the seared, hateful word. "He's not just hunting us," he said. "He's hunting a memory. He wants everyone who ever loved an Arapaho to suffer. He wants the world to forget that people like Tohono ever existed," Elara whispered. "Then we need to remind them." Jacob had no badge, no army, no allies, but he had the truth. And he had a fire inside him that hadn't burned in 15 long years. They made their camp in the foothills outside Stillwater. Jacob crafted a plan, one built not from bullets, but from proof. That night, they visited the church records in town, the old, dusty parlor behind the chapel where donations and letters were stored. Elara remembered a letter her father had once burned after reading it, a letter from Redding, warning him about his daughter's dishonor. It was still there, the half-charred draft copy, saved by a meticulous church clerk. The letter contained the threat, the slur, and the unmistakable angry handwriting. Jacob took it and wrapped it in a cloth. Next, they rode to the new marshal's cabin. The deputy was young, but he listened. Jacob laid down the piece of branded leather, the charred letter from Redding, and told him everything, his voice steady, not asking for trust, but commanding it. "We're not here to hang anyone," Jacob said. "We're here to show you the rope." The deputy looked between the two of them, his eyes wide. Then he nodded. "Redding arrives on Friday. He's been gathering men. But if this is true, the people of this town ought to know who they're letting into their homes." Ilara stepped forward. "I don't need them to love me," she said. "I just need them to see me as a person, not as a lesson." Jacob looked at her, a fierce pride flickering in his chest. They were no longer fugitives. They were witnesses. The fight wasn't over, but the silence was. Stillwater had not seen a crowd this size in years. The townsfolk gathered near the courthouse steps, not because they were ordered to, but because they were curious. Rumors had flown all week of a mountain man, a traitor woman, and a war ghost coming home to stir old ashes. Jacob Kane stood beneath the harsh midday sun, the sweat lining his brow, but his voice did not falter. Before him sat Mayor Thompson, the town's reluctant moderator, and beside the mayor, a small panel of elders and deputies, all pretending not to grip the arms of their chairs too tightly. "I have here," Jacob began, holding up a small packet of papers, a letter written by Clayton Redding to William Crane, accusing his own daughter of shame and calling for the death of the man she loved. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Jacob laid the letter on the table, then held up the burned piece of tanned leather. "And this," he said, his voice ringing out, "was found nailed to a cabin where that same girl was left to die. Branded. By hand, the same script, the same slur." He looked out over the people. Many of them avoided his gaze. A few did not. Next came the photograph. Jacob pulled it from his coat pocket. A grainy, black and white image, stained by time and smoke. It showed a line of soldiers outside a burning Arapaho village. One man stood at the front, tall and bearded, with a distinctive long-barreled revolver slung at his side. "That weapon," Jacob said, turning toward the panel, "is unique. It has a custom trigger guard, a double-notched hammer. Only 6 were ever made for the field captains under the Wyoming militia. One of them," he said, his voice dropping, "belonged to Clayton Redding." Clayton Redding, who had been standing to the side with his arms crossed, his face a mask of arrogant disdain, had not spoken yet. Now he did. "This is a circus," he barked. "These are just war stories. Accusations from a deserter and a woman who betrayed her own blood." Someone in the crowd murmured their agreement. Redding's voice rose, playing to the crowd's fear. "We're talking about people who consorted with murderers, who welcomed savages into their beds. What's next? Will we let them raise our children?" A few more heads nodded in the square, but not all of them. Then came the quiet interruption. "I was there." A voice, old and cracked, croaked from the crowd. An old man stepped from the shade near the sheriff's office, his back bent, his beard white and thin, one hand clutching a wooden cane. "I was the field surgeon under the militia the night of the Stillwater raid." Jacob stepped aside, giving the man the platform. The old man approached the platform slowly, his knees shaking, but his voice was steady. Redding gave the order. No quarter, no captives. He said he wanted the land washed clean. We attacked before dawn. We burned everything. His gaze found Jacob's. "That was the night your wife and daughter died." Redding scoffed. "Lies from a dying drunk." The doctor looked at him then, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "You buried your guilt in whiskey, Redding. I buried mine in silence. But only one of us still dreams of the fire." The mayor had turned pale. Others in the crowd lowered their heads in shame. And then Alara stepped forward. No escort, no shame. She walked to the front of the crowd, her hands at her sides. Then, without a word, she reached behind her and untied the back of her blouse. A collective gasp cut through the silence. Across her back were a series of long, twisted scars, raised like ropes of wax, some still red around the edges. Wounds that could not be hidden by time or fabric. Alara's voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the square. "These were not left by Arapaho blades," she said. "They were not made in the woods by tribal men. They were given to me by white hands, by Christian hands, by men who said they were saving me from my own sin." She faced the crowd now, her eyes unwavering. "Tohono did not chain me. He taught me how to grow food with one hand and how to shoot a hawk with the other. He did not own me. He listened to me, and he died protecting me." She turned toward Redding, her gaze like a burning ember. "You didn't have me hung to punish love. You did it to silence it." A profound, heavy silence hung over the square, thick as ash. No one clapped. No one shouted. But no one looked at Clayton Redding the same way again. The truth had been spoken not from pulpits or from the barrel of a gun, but from skin and from memory. The fire of justice had not burned out. It had just begun. Clayton Redding was sentenced by his own kind, their words as sharp as bullets, the truths they had ignored for too long now heavier than iron. He was taken away without honor, without a crowd to cheer for his downfall. The town of Stillwater, once so proud of its silence, now found a new, uncertain strength in listening. Jacob and Alara did not stay to watch the gallows being built. They left the next morning, before the sun had risen, riding back toward the high, lonely hills, toward the only place that had ever felt like a home. It took them 3 days to reach the ridge. The old, abandoned hunting cabin was still there, though the door hung loose on its leather hinges and the windows were cracked. Jacob fixed it first, not with the urgency of a man on the run, but with the slow, deliberate care of a man who is building something to last. Alara gathered fresh pine needles for their bedding and stripped willow bark to boil for a pain medicine. They moved as if they had done it 100 times before, as if the place had been waiting for them to return. Weeks passed. They cleared a small space for a garden, dug a new, clean well, and planted beans and squash. Jacob built an extra room onto the side of the cabin, his hands remembering more than just the feel of a rifle. Alara painted the door with a blue ash she made from crushed wildflowers. "For peace," she said, a small, soft smile on her lips. People started to arrive. A young boy whose parents had thrown him out for marrying a Cheyenne girl. A woman with a long, thin scar down her cheek and nowhere else to go. A wounded horse limping from a hunter's bullet. The small cabin on the ridge became a place not of exile, but of return. Jacob watched it grow, and he felt something in his chest, something that had been coiled tight for 15 years, finally begin to uncoil. One evening, as the sun slipped, behind the ridgeline, staining the mountains a deep, rich red gold, he walked up the path to where Alara stood, near the split-rail fence he had just finished. He didn't bring her flowers. He didn't kneel. He just stood there, the dust on his boots, his hat in his hand, his eyes steady and clear. "You don't need to say yes," he murmured. "There's no ring, no preacher, no whiskey toast." She turned toward him slowly, a question in her eyes. "I just need to know," he continued, his voice a low, rough whisper, "that you'll still be here when the sun drops behind that tree, and the next night, and the night after that." She stepped closer, her hands resting lightly on the front of his shirt. "Tohono was only my first storm," she said. "He broke the locks on my cage. He taught me how to feel the fire." She reached up and touched Jacob's face, her fingers tracing the lines of his scar. "But you," her voice trembled, "you taught me how to feel the stillness. That love doesn't have to be lightning to be real. That it can be the sound of wood creaking under the moonlight, the scent of smoke on flannel." Jacob said nothing. He only closed his eyes, his forehead resting against hers. She whispered, "You are tomorrow." They didn't wed by any law but their own. They didn't take any vows before witnesses. But from that night on, the wind seemed quieter through. The trees and the fire inside their small cabin never went out. Months later, a letter was found, tucked inside the pages of a donated book at the Stillwater schoolhouse. It bore no signature, but the handwriting was elegant, feminine, and steady. "I was once loved by a warrior who held my heart in his hands like a blade, fierce, bright, and sharp with the weight of 1,000 battles. Now I live with a man who holds my heart like the soil, soft, steady, and strong enough to plant something new in. Tohono taught me how to fight. The other taught me how to stay. I have learned that love is not proven in how loud you shout or how far you run. It is proven in how long you stay when the fire is out and the nights are quiet. He is not my captor. He is not my savior. He is simply the one who stayed." And that is enough dot in the heart of a land that had been carved by wind and by fire, too. Souls that had once been broken by war, by blood, by loss, found something they never thought they would feel again. Not just survival, but peace. Not just a memory, but a reason to stay. Jacob and Ilara were never crowned by a church bell or praised in any history book. But their story remains in the small, sturdy cabin on the ridge, in the blue wildflowers that bloom every spring, and in the quiet, certain knowing that love, when it is chosen freely, can outlast even the deepest, most painful scars. Thank you for watching this story on Wild West Love Stories, where hearts still dare to beat in the dust and the silence of the frontier. If this tale moved you, if it made you believe in second chances, in a love that heals, and in the strength of choosing kindness over fear, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and ride with us again. Because out here, every love leaves its own trail.